Right, hello, good afternoon everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this discussion, which is organised by LSE IDEAS in partnership with the RATSU Forum. And if you want to tweet about this event, the hashtag is LSE at Europe. So my name is Abby Innes. I'm a political economist at the European Institute of the LSE. I'm going to be chairing this session. And we have a really fantastic panel of speakers in to address the challenges of clientelism and state capture in the European Union and in the accession countries. Now, in the circumstances, I think we also need to include the UK. I feel as though we almost need to thank David Cameron for advertising this event quite so effectively for us. He really shouldn't have. What I'd really like to do is welcome our really excellent panel. To begin with, we have Professor Elizabeth David-Barrett, who is Director for the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex. We have Dr. Tena Prelet, who is Research Fellow at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford. We have Dr. Dusan Pavlovic, who is from the Political Science Faculty at the University of Belgrade. And last but by no means least, we have Dr. Andrea Lorenzo Capussela, who we are lucky enough to have returning to us as a visiting fellow at the LSE's Government Department. Now, because we only have 90 minutes and our speakers really like a discussion, we're actually going to limit presentations to 7 minutes. And then we're going to open this up to a Q&A. And Liz has very kindly agreed to start us off. So she's going to begin by situating the problem of state capture for us. So Liz, I shall hand over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Abby. Yeah, so I'm going to try and talk about the concept and how our understanding of it, particularly with a view to thinking about what's happening in Europe, has changed over the last 20 years. And it's a concept that I first became aware of in the late 90s, early 2000s. When I think Hellman and Kaufman developed this concept of state capture. And the idea of it very much was that it was about interest groups, usually private sector interest groups, that were able to improperly influence the formation of law and policy. And so they distinguished it from the improper influence over the implementation of policy. And they said that this state capture that occurs at that formation of policy stage, or perhaps the formation of laws, is particularly damaging, because what you're doing is really then shaping the rules of the game in which everybody else is then operating afterwards, and doing it in a way that benefits those interest groups who've managed to influence it. So I think it looked like a really useful concept at the time, particularly because we'd just witnessed privatization happening in Russia, lots of parts of the former Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe. And particularly in Russia, I think this was really an archetypal case. What seemed to have happened in privatization is that those state assets had been given to a few private interests, a few oligarchs, and they had very much been able to capture the process and then capture a whole lot of laws around that, which allowed those assets which they owned to operate in very favourable conditions for them. So it was, I think, very much a sort of function of the policy processes that were going on at the time. And of course, in post-communist transition, you are essentially moving these assets from the public sector to the private sector. So it's sort of very clear the direction of travel that you've got there. At the time, there was a bit of variation in this. So there was some great work by Janine Vedel, who talked about there being, it wasn't just sort of unidirectional, but there were also what she called institutional nomads, particularly in Russia, who were kind of moving in and out of the private sector, depending on what was strategic or tactical. So wherever was the best place to be, where you could best avoid accountability and get access to the opportunities, they would move, these institutional nomads. But more or less, the concept of state capture was used for the idea of private sector interests capturing the state. And I think that is a concept that has changed over time. So if we then look at what's happened more recently, in particular, we see a lot more captured by political elites. So this seems to be something that is much more led by the political elites who are in the state. They have got into power, often democratically, but then they're using and abusing that power in a way that expands their influence and control over the state and makes it much more difficult for anyone to challenge that. And I think a classic example of this in Europe is Hungary under Orban. And we've seen that he has really perfected in a way this capture by the political elite. So, for example, in some research that I've done with Mihai Fazekas, we've looked particularly at how they've managed to distort the procurement process. And in a way, public procurement is your kind of successor to privatization in the region, in terms of, here's the main way that you can get money out of the state into the private sector. So we look at particularly how that process is vulnerable. And what you see there, and you often see elsewhere with public procurement, is you get this kind of machine politics where the classic kind of machine is that businesses help politicians get into power and stay in power, sometimes through donations to parties, sometimes by the businesses giving them favorable media coverage. And then in return, the politicians give contracts to business. So again, you've got this collaboration between public and private government and business. But what Orban's done is really extended that. So he said, well, if you're in power and you've got this great machine politics going, then surely what you want to do is not just control that allocation of resources so that your allies get rich and they keep you in power, but you want to do everything you can to close down the challenges to you and to stay in power. And the best way to do that is to expand your capture influence, if you like, to weaken or capture any kind of accountability institutions which others might use to hold you to account. And so in this paper that I was mentioning, Brand Corruption and Government Change, we talk about how they've expanded their influence into this third sphere, and they're actually actively disabling those accountability institutions, trying to neutralize the risk that they'll be able to hold them to account and they'll be able to lose office. And they do that largely through politicized appointments to the judiciary, to audit institutions, also to the bureaucracy, the implementers. They do it by squashing civil society and free speech. And so starting to change that balance of power. So it's not so much then that you've got politicians who need business to keep them in office, but politicians have become business. There's this blurring of ownership, and then facilitated by things like shell companies that allow people to hide the proceeds of corruption in the names of other people and no one realizes. So I think you see this definitely in Hungary, but you also see it in Turkey, to an extent in Poland and in the Balkans. So it skews that whole system. And what it means is that to get on economically, you need first and foremost to have good connections, not necessarily to have some great company or product. So I think we've definitely seen the shift towards the politics-led kind of state capture, which creates a whole new set of opportunities. But it also raises the question for me as to whether this is really anything new and whether state capture is adding anything particularly valuable. And that's because actually this really starts to look just like that kind of clientelism and machine politics that we might associate more with historically with Italy or with Greece. And also looks pretty similar to neo-patrimonialism in lots of parts of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly this kind of it's our turn to eat logic. You get into government, and when you get into government, you steal as much as you can because you know that when the next guys get into government, they're going to do exactly the same thing. So one question I have really is whether this kind of politics-led state capture is adding much beyond what we already knew with clientelism.
Fantastic, thank you. That's immaculate timing, if I may say, within the 7 minutes. I think it's fascinating about public procurement too, that in contrast to privatization, it's kind of a gift that keeps on giving, in the sense that all departments can participate in it, whereas in the post-communist privatization, it tended to be funneled through particular agencies. So there's this fairly catastrophic, as it were, universalism of public procurement in terms of state agencies. It kind of makes it so powerful. Fantastic. We're going to move to Dusan, who I think is going to enlarge on these issues and talk about the political economy of state capture and how this plays out. So Dusan, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Abby. Hello, everyone. So once again, I'm Dusan Pavlovic from the Belgrade Faculty of Political Science. I will talk about what's new in state capture in this region in Southeast Europe, and I will try to give some ideas about what Lise asked at the very end. Is this only another form of clientelism, or is it something new or something very important that affects other processes and other political science concepts? So I would agree, and I couldn't agree more, that what's happening right now in terms of state capture is a new form of state capture, a new version of state capture, which didn't exist when the research about it began in the beginning of 21st century, right? I have two claims now. Now we know already from the mid-2000s research that it's politics driven. It's not only economic concept, right? So, and we know this from the books by Anna Grzmala-Busse and from Ines's article. We know now that there is a political capture, political party capture, where politicians took over. Now, the difference is, I think, is not exclusively that politicians took over this from the private agents, as we found out in the beginning of the 21st century and throughout the 90s, just to become rich instead of private agents. So although this cannot be excluded, I mean, this wish, this preference to get rich, this is not, I think, the major process and not the major thing that we should be interested in. State capture, at least in this region, Southeast Europe, is a kind of sub-variety of state capture, which became dominantly a way of winning and maintaining political office. And so you have this whole apparatus, machinery of political parties, which extracts from the state various kinds of resources only to be able to win next elections. And this is the major process which is taking place right now. And I will give you one example only that can very precisely show this. In November 2020, Ivo Sanader, former Croat premier, was sentenced for corruption and he had to pay some 9 million euros. This was a long process, but beside him, several other people were sentenced. But beside them, Croat Democratic Party, HDZ, which was the leading party in Croatia during the 90s and then after 2000 in some period, and actually is in office today, this party was also charged for corruption as a legal entity, and it had to pay 2 million euros. This was the first time that political party was very precisely described as somebody who was involved in corruption as a party. So not only as a band of individuals, but as political parties. So we know what's happening. They had their own secret account where they kept money. So Ivo Sanader was extracting money from the budget, but he didn't use everything for himself, for his cronies. It was used also for the party as a party so that it can use it for next elections, next political or electoral campaign. So this is my first claim. I think this is something new, right? And the second claim is that we can now be more precise about measuring state capture. Because these ways how state is captured and how public funds are extracted, they changed, right? So as Lise pointed out, before, in the beginning, it was about policy regulations. So private agents made public officials change public policies, regulations, so that they can have advantage on market. It's not about this anymore. Now the political parties want money directly from the budget and directly from public procurement system, which is in many ways connected to the budget, but also to public companies, right? And now we can measure this more precisely, because the ways how state capture was measured so far was in a very subjective manner. So it would be a questionnaire where somebody would ask some people, usually experts, what they think about state capture. Does it exist in your country or not? Is it big? Is it large? Or is it small? And then you will have in the end some kind of subjective opinion about the thing. Now we don't have to think about, we don't have to measure the whole thing in such a subjective way, because we can be pretty exact in some cases what's the extent of state capture. For example, to go back to this Ivo Sanader case, it was 2 million euros, right? So HDZ was charged, the Croatian ruling party, when he was the prime minister, was charged 2 million euros. So this is the extent of waste of public funds that can be pretty objectively measured, right? In some other cases, when we find out about the abuse of public procurement system or various other manners, which I don't have enough time to get into right now, we can also be more objective. So this is another novelty. Measurement of state capture became more objective, and therefore the whole thing became more relevant. Now, why is this important? Because I think state capture is now the major driving force in the economic and political process, at least in this region. And state capture now affects several other very important political science concepts or political economic concepts. And this is political party organizations, the whole party system, public administration, the type of capitalism or a variety of capitalism. We know this from this discussion about variety of capitalism, and constitutional democracy itself. So in all these areas, we see changes over the past 20 years because we have the increase in state capture or more dominant state capture process. It is this major important concept which make changes in all these areas. And this is why I think we should study it and go to it more deeply. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you. And I know this is raising something that Liz is interested in too, this question of how much it subverts, and for the UK, you know, that for any case where this dynamic really gets going, what Dusan is really highlighting is how much this has the potential to subvert pretty much the whole polity in terms of all its key institutions, and how devastating that can be. So how serious this issue is. That brings us to Tena, who's going to elaborate on how this has been playing out in the Western Balkans. So Tena.
Thank you, Abby. Let me say just how happy I am that we're having this conversation today, because I actually think that part of the reason why we find corruption so intractable today is that we often situate it neatly in boxes. We measure it in countries or at best in regions. And this is reflected or maybe even partially caused by the way that we measure it, as Dusan already addressed. As we know, the countries that usually top the list of the most virtuous countries of the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International are also some of those countries that enable global flows of corruption, that enable plutocracy. So similarly, there have been very few attempts to put developments going on in seemingly developed countries such as the EU and developing countries in terms of corruption. And yet, as both Liz and Dusan have highlighted, such parallels of course exist, and they're very much needed. So I think it's really great that we're having this discussion, and that it's something that that we can build on in the future. So I will follow on Liz's comments about this shift towards a politics-led form of state capture, and on what Dusan outlined very neatly as this new form of corruption, of state capture present in the Balkans, and focus on a specific issue that I've been researching in recent times, which is my research on foreign actors and corruption in the Balkans. So in my article titled The Vicious Circle of Corrosive Capital, Authoritarian Tendencies and State Capture in the Western Balkans, I argue basically that this increased flirting with non-Western actors in the Balkans, this increased ties with semi-authoritarian or authoritarian countries that have been investing more prominently in several countries of the Western Balkans, has provided yet another avenue by which state capture occurs in the Balkans. So as Dusan has already explained, the processes of democratic change and Europeanization in the Western Balkan countries are heavily inhibited today by an ingrained system of patronage and clientelism, which in my view includes also this influx of corrosive capital. So for those who are not familiar with this term, corrosive capital refers to flows of money, be they loans or investments, that abuse of weaknesses in the rule of law and make these rule of law weaknesses even larger. So part and parcel of this dynamic, I would argue, is the meeting of minds at the top. So in a way, this backsliding of democracy or this increased authoritarianism that you can see in the Western Balkans, but also reflected in other areas of the world today, adds this influx of non-transparent flows of money from countries that are authoritarian. And I elaborate on these in this article by elaborating on the extractive practices that are used, following on work by Jamal and Robinson, but also on Dusan's excellent book, The Money Wasting Machine, which I warmly recommend to all students of corruption in the Balkans. So it is hypothesized that the workings of this vicious circle are as follows. As I said, the presence of illiberal democracy facilitates the access to corrosive capital. This in turn solidifies the elites in power and destroys political competition. Yeah, so pluralism is diminished, thus ossifying state capture even more and reinforcing the circle. This has another important effect, which is that it heightens the disillusionment in the possibility of change among the citizens. Therefore, the trust in institutions, which is well known to be very low in the Balkans, is even further exacerbated. And citizens, by not having faith in the democratic process, they either don't really take part in it wholeheartedly, or they end up leaving the country. As we know, immigration is one of the foremost issues in Southeastern Europe today. And this in turn hardens even more the dominance of the political and economic elites. Now, this is this pessimistic scenario, yeah. And I think it's also important to note that in all these dynamics, the demand side of this problem trumps the supply side, meaning, yes, you can have these non-transparent investments coming from authoritarian countries, but the dominant variable, in my view, is the way by which the recipient countries accept these investments. So the filter is within the countries, yeah. I will now add briefly that, in my view, we talk a lot about, state capture from a very practical, money-based point of view. But I also think that it's important to note that this specific form of capture is also made possible by a form of narrative capture. So in the specific case of these foreign investments that I've just managed, I would argue that this goes in parallel with the construction of a political narrative of friends coming to the rescue, as presented by the local political leadership. In this case, I'm specifically referring to Serbia, that is able to present themselves as the saviors of the nation by drawing from friends coming from abroad, from these funds coming from abroad, and thus sort of saving the population and preserving the ontological security of the nation. And I think it's really interesting how this has played out during the coronavirus crisis, by the way, so we can talk about that a bit later. This narrative capture is complemented by a whole arsenal of other methods that are used to steer the narrative. So just some, just some of the tools in this semi-authoritarian playbook are as follows. Of course, regime-friendly media that amplify the messages they like from abroad and from and domestic ones, and attack those that they dislike. Then we have the game on the social media. It is probably interesting to remember that over 8,000 bots of the Serbian ruling party have been banned by Twitter in recent times. We have attacks on individuals that are placed through parliament, social media, and tabloids, etc. We have attacks on institutes, on research institutes, on think tanks, and even the creation of parallel institutions such as gongos and even regime-friendly universities. So this goes, hand in hand with what Liz mentioned of, in terms of the destruction of alternatives that is part and parcel of this wider state capture game. Now, what is happening in countries that have already joined the European Union? I would argue, making the example of two other East European but EU countries that are Croatia and Bulgaria, that while the specific issue of the foreign capital, this corrosive capital, is lower, perhaps even, the EU influx has provided a good influence in that respect. They have not been able to stem other instances of state capture that were touched upon before. So using the case of Croatia, so this issue of Russian and Chinese investments exploiting governance weaknesses is lower. For instance, one example could be the construction of the Pelješac Bridge by Chinese investors, which was done according to an EU mandated tender, and it is proceeding by the book, in contrast with a lot of the controversial investments that are happening elsewhere in the region, such as in Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. And yet there are huge problems in the judiciary, and there are huge problems in terms of clientelism at the very highest levels and in terms of public procurement. We can get into that more in detail later. But basically, the takeaway is the bad apples in Croatian politics are eliminated only when it is unsustainable to keep them on board. Otherwise, they keep being in the system. And the HDS's, purported renovation, even under this new moderate leadership, is not wholehearted. It is just on the surface. In Bulgaria, similar things happen, but perhaps with an even higher intensity. And really, I would argue that there is a subordination of the state to private elite interests. Just some of the recent scandals, the KTB Bank, Ahmed Dogan, a former politician, still very influential, who suddenly emerges as owning an electricity company. And then also shakes hands with the American ambassador. It is important to add. So these things are completely normalized. So my argument would be that while Croatia and Bulgaria have a more domestic than foreign added state capture, so they have been able to kind of lower this issue that I talked about at the beginning, but those domestic issues have not been addressed yet. Just finally, to conclude, I would address the issue of the tipping point. So where is it that we can try to redress this vicious circle? Two quick examples. One specifically in relation to these corrosive capital and potential corrosive investments coming from abroad. So one of the most controversial investments in Serbia has been the Belgrade waterfront project from a UAE investor from the United Arab Emirates. It is less known that Zagreb had a similar type of project called Zagreb Manhattan, with the very same players involved. And yet within the Zagreb City Council that in recent years, in 2017, managed to get more pluralism, they managed to squash this project. So this controversial issue was stemmed, and I think this highlights how important political pluralism and everything that goes towards enhancing political pluralism is in terms of countering state capture. And finally, I think that it is really relevant to note that the country in the Western Balkans for which we would all have thought a year ago that it's impossible that it would change power was Montenegro. And yet in August 2020, we have a very imperfect coalition of opposition parties that in a very specific political, social, economic conjuncture manages to come to power. What is important here? The important thing is that after this event, the confidence of the citizens in Montenegro in the possibility of change through elections has changed very, very sharply. So according to a BEPAG survey, 80% of the citizens in Montenegro now believe in change through elections, whereas this same percentage is 43% in Serbia and 38% in Albania. So more than double in Montenegro. So my one ray of hope that I'm leaving you with now is that once set in motion, people at least start believing that change is possible. And this is, I think, where we need to start to look at possible solutions to redress the vicious circle that I outlined at the beginning. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tena. And I think that's such an interesting question, this question of how do you begin to get virtuous circles? You know, what are the tipping points that start to make things more progressive, but also in turn, what are the tipping points that get us into these vicious cycles? So I think that's a good thing to come back to in the questions. Last, but by no means least, Andrea is going to talk to us about the limits of the state capture concept and sort of, I think, take us all the way back to where Liz opened up. So Andrea, if you want to take over.
Yes, thank you, Abby. And it was a pleasure to listen to Liz, Tena, and Dusan. As you said, to their points, I would like to add my own doubts on the theory of state capture, which are not very far from what Liz said. Few people, I think, would claim that this theory is a sufficient one to understand these problems. My question is whether it is a necessary one. The seminal paper, which Liz mentioned, Hellman and others, 2000, defines state capture like this, I quote, the efforts of firms to shape and influence the underlying rules of the game, it is legislation, laws, rules, and decrees, through private payments to public officials, unquote. Now, compare this passage with a recent text on Western capitalism by Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times. I quote, corporations exercise immense influence within society. Who makes the rules of the game? We know that a dominant influence is the power of money. Corporations are not players of the game, playing according to rules set by others. They play the game according to rules they largely set themselves, unquote. So, with one exception, this satisfied the definition of state capture I just gave you. And the exception is the payments to public officials. But does it matter? If the influence on public policies derives not from an exchange between a rule and a sum of money, but from stable collusion between economic and political elites, then I think not much changes. The effects on policies are the same, and surely the degree of influence matters more than the means by which influence is acquired, which is a question that hinges on often legalistic distinctions between outright bribery on one hand and campaign financing, lobbying, revolving doors, other things on the other. So if a theory tells us that there is fairly little difference between a phenomenon usually associated with weak states and little difference between that and between what now happens in rich consolidated democracies, then I think the theory is not so useful in the end. Of course, state capture theory has evolved relative to that seminal paper, as we have just heard from Dusan in particular, and is a sophisticated theory. Still, its core claim is what I said. And that claim would signal that similar problems are affecting very different societies, where we would expect to see different phenomena. Let's take one example, Italy and Kosovo, which are, by the way, the only countries I can discuss with some confidence. Now, Dusan and Tena and Liz as well all mentioned procurement, for example. Now, listen to this. In Italy, the per kilometer cost of high-speed railway tracks was, at constant prices, about 5 times greater than in France, Spain, or Japan. In Kosovo, the per kilometer cost of highways was 2.5 times greater than in Germany. And in both cases, corruption was involved or widely suspected. Criminality, I mean, high-level criminality. In Italy, the 4 prime ministers that held office for half of the period between the early 80s and 2011 were all found guilty of serious crimes: corruption, tax fraud, aiding the mafia even. So for 20 of those 40 years, my country was ruled by criminals, convicted criminals. In Kosovo, a former prime minister and head of state is now being tried for war crimes, but not for corruption or organized crime. And finally, in the World Bank's rule of law indicator, Italy stands much closer to Balkan levels than to her G7 peers. Kosovo, conversely, is near the average of its peers. So it would seem that both Kosovo and Italy have a state capture problem. And if we compare each to their respective peers, Italy's problems look worse than Kosovo's. Because the distance between Italy and France, Germany, and Spain, for instance, is significantly greater than the distance between Kosovo and its neighbors. And yet, when we look at one crucial institution for the rule of law, the judicial system, the analysis changes. In Kosovo, it is controlled by politics. A 2012 EU report writes that in Kosovo, judges and prosecutors tend to act, I quote, in anticipatory obedience to external influences. In other words, to get what they want, politicians don't have to threaten, bribe, or even call judges, because they do spontaneously what politicians want them to do. In Italy, on the contrary, judges and prosecutors are fiercely independent. This expression is used in a US diplomatic cable released by WikiLeaks. It's, of course, problematic to quote such documents, but in this case, I think it's legitimate, and I'll be happy to explain why. And what's most interesting is that this is a comparative assessment, fiercely independent. It's a comparative assessment, because the context of the cable is the scandal that broke out when it emerged that the CIA had kidnapped several terrorist suspects in Germany, Sweden, and other European states. And the comparison, which is implicit but very clear, is with them. And to support this analysis, by the way, I'll remind you that besides those 4 former prime ministers, in the 90s, Italy's prosecutors sent to trial maybe 1/3 of the whole political and economic elites of the country for corruption. So is Italy a captured state like Kosovo, if Kosovo is one indeed, or not? And if the judiciary is a crucial institution for the rule of law, how can we have such differences? How can we square them with the state capture narrative? My answer very briefly is that we should look at institutions first, at the allocation of power in a society, and especially at the obstacles to collective action, which is linked to what Tena just said about what we saw in these demonstrations against urban developments. And collective action, I think, is likely to be the main question. Kosovo proves this point, I think, because it, like Montenegro, it has just managed to unseat an elite that until very recently seemed unchallengeable, because it was homogeneous, arguably more than Montenegro's, and controlled political, economic, criminal, and military power. What happened is that a grassroots movement arose about a decade ago. It built up support with an anti-corruption and an egalitarian, inclusive growth manifesto. And last February, they won 50% of the vote, 3 times as much as the next party. So the shift is even more dramatic than in Montenegro. In Italy, we're not there yet to conclude the parallel, chiefly, I think, because political parties are not doing that job, the job of organizing collective action. Thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. That raises, I think, a wonderful agenda for us to explore now in the Q&A. So I'm going to go to the great questions that we're already getting in, and one that has had a lot of endorsement, so it's clearly one that a lot of people are asking, is from Bernard Casey, which is directed at Liz, but I think it's a good question for everybody, which is how new is this problem, in the sense that Hellman and Kaufman are writing about the post-communist environment specifically, but as Bernard is pointing out, we've known for a long time that business interest groups are co-opted by governments to help fashion legislation, specifically when they feel they lack in-house expertise. So that partnership is not new. So how do we differentiate what we think is going on now from that sort of historical importance of strategic corporate interests in government decision making? What else is going on? What's the additional dynamic that we're tending to identify that makes it different from sort of that kind of, you could call it collusion, you could call it cooperation. What's new about the state capture that we've been talking about? Liz, do you want to go first with that?
Sure. So I'm not sure there's that much that's new, but a couple of things that are possibly exacerbated in the last 20-25 years. So one I would say is this, what you allude to actually in the question, this complexity of policy making. So I do think it's the case that actually the challenges facing policymakers have become a lot more complex and a lot more technical. And that means it's harder, I think, to have it work on this model of having bureaucrats who are expert at policy, but not expert in a particular area. And it does mean that there's more reliance on outside interests who've got particular areas of technical expertise to come in, and potentially then they have a lot of power because the people on the other side don't necessarily have the skills to be able to differentiate between whether what they're being told by those interests is the truth or a fair account, or whether they're being slightly led astray to benefit that group. So I do think that's a really tricky problem. And you see this with financial services regulation. Yeah, I mean, most of the regulators really struggle to keep on top of the vast speed of innovation in financial services and to be able to hold that to account. And I think we start to see it with the tech sector as well. So I do think there's an issue of increased complexity. There's also different patterns of how the state then operates. So we've also seen a massive increase in outsourcing, and that's become the norm. And that also creates a whole load of overlap between public and private, and a real blurring of the distinctions between public and private. And often, that's led to a situation where, initially it was supposed to be driven by, let's have more competition and that will create more efficiency. But actually what we often end up with is just, a few big private sector companies that are essentially a parallel state, providing most of those services, not necessarily much competition for most of those tenders, and not necessarily more efficient. So I think that's another big trend that we have seen, and probably just to sort of finish off, what I would say is that there are going to be these tensions. There is really complexity, and there could also be benefits to involving the private sector. But what's really important is that you keep enough expertise on the state side to be able to have accountability over the private sector, and that you also complement that with a lot of transparency and freedom of information about how public money is being spent and how public policy is being made. And if you can sort of keep that, then you've got some chance of maintaining the balance of power in a way that the state and democratic institutions can still hold that power to account, even though you've got more blurring.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Anyone else on the panel want to come in on that question of what's new, what's distinctive about the dynamics of the last 30 years, say, compared to the kind of post-war traditions of various forms of corporatism, various forms of cooperation? What's the added problematic?
I could weigh in on a specific aspect, which is something that Abby, you've raised via email before the panel, which is its increasing transnational trend of dynamics of corruption and state capture. And I mean, in that sense, first, something perhaps positive, which I think that we are becoming better at investigating it and exposing it, largely thanks to the collaboration of investigative journalists worldwide. But I mean, the main point here is that corruption has become fully global. So clearly also the avenues and the possibilities for it to play out in everywhere have increased. And linked to that is that it is also a moving target. So unfortunately today, if you regulate very well, I don't know, let's say the legal industry in London, and you stem, any opportunity of creating offshore structures through the UK, which of course is not the case. But even if you do that, you will have other new centers of international money laundering that pop up. And partially we have seen that happening already with, for instance, as Switzerland has sort of waned a little bit because they've increased controls, and partially, let's say, the UK, and now there are high hopes for the US, by the way, to do so. We've seen a lot of these dynamics shifting onto Dubai, for instance. But as the global challenges rise, I think there is also this global potential in countering it, not only through journalism, but also through other kind of mechanisms. And I think it's absolutely needed to do that. But unfortunately, I also think it's not this potential of collaboration and cooperation is not used enough now. Why? Because there is not enough political will. So we're yet to see the moment in which this coordination will happen. But I do think that, what is happening in the US now, with the Biden administration putting really corruption as a national security issue, raising it to that level, is very promising, because it is from those places, from the UK and the US, that traditionally and historically have been the drivers of these kind of dynamics. So from these places, we need to also start to see the beginning of the solution.
Thank you. Can I just add another dimension into that question, which is about the role of neoliberalism in all this, because it's been an important ideology of transition in the post-communist environment, and of course it's been the dominant ideology over the last 40 years in Western Europe, particularly in the Anglosphere, and but also obviously elsewhere and through the single European market. And it's part of the principle of neoliberalism that the private sector is seen as sort of morally and functionally superior to the public sphere. And as a result, through the new public management, we've basically brought the private sector into the state, pretty much all the way from agenda setting to policy enactment. We've made, Colin Crouch talks about the state being made into a semi-permeable membrane in which the state is completely porous to business, but refrains from regulating business in the way that it used to. So is there any sense in which neoliberalism has basically salted the battlefield of the state, that it's created the preconditions, the ties, the connections between public officials and politicians in the corporate sector, and it then becomes a very small step indeed to turn those informal relationships into corrupt relationships? I mean, can I ask each of you what you feel is, how much of this is a kind of unanticipated consequence of ideological change, that it's happening on the scale that we see it in? Andrea, I don't know if you want to start with that, and then we sort of go through.
Yes, with pleasure. I think it did have a role. Let's look at it from the perspective I tried to suggest to you before: collective action, the collective action problem. For society to organize collective action, there needs to be a sense that things can be done together in a way. individualism, ideological, even methodological individualism, doesn't necessarily help. This can be linked to the influence of neoliberalism. I would also link this to what, for example, Branko Milanovic writes about the increasing commercialization of our lives in contemporary capitalism, in which we start selling our time, our houses, our cars. The time we would spend at a meeting to organize a demonstration in Belgrade against Belgrade waterfront, we are ready to attach a price to it, which is the price of the foregone revenue of doing babysitting or dog sitting for someone. And if this raises the collective action problem, then it is a problem. Because, I mean, we started off with clientelism and state capture are part of our title. And the question was, is there anything really new in state capture compared to classical clientelism? I don't think very much. And clientelism is precisely that. It is, if you like, a clear collective action problem. Everyone that is engaged in it knows that it is a bad system because it creates bad policy, but if you want to have employment, you better be tied to a clientelistic politician. So you will go on doing it unless you feel that everyone is ready to reject the system. But for that to happen, you need to have collective action.
Fantastic. And you end up with that first performer problem. Who will take the risk? Who's going to sort of step out into this perhaps quite dangerous light? Does anyone else want to come in, Dusan or
I may just comment very briefly. I think you have a point here, Abby, because especially if you have in mind this new public management approach, which was extremely popular in the 80s and 90s and came out of this neoliberal viewpoint. And the basic idea was that the private sector will more efficiently take care of public needs than the public sector itself, right? Now, it turns out, I think we still are waiting for a study that would revisit the whole concept within specific and different contexts. It turns out, for example, that in Scandinavian countries, such kind of approach can work very, very well and without too high social costs. Yeah. But in the context of the Western Balkans, and, Southeast Europe, and as we can see now, almost half of the post-communist world, it turned out to be much more costly than what we had during communism in some aspects, right? Now you can see, I will just finish by going to this to new book by Ivan Seleny and Mihaly, I forgot the first name, Petr Mihaly, yeah, about varieties of post-communist capitalism. It seems that this idea that opening itself to the market in the beginning exposed or made these countries, post-communist countries, to take different or divergent paths out of communism. Now we can see that they are converging or reconverging toward the very same system that we can see in China, or maybe even better in Russia. Yeah? So Hungary, Poland, countries that were champions of transition in the 90s and after 2000s, they look pretty much similar to Serbia and Kosovo and Montenegro today. Yeah. I believe, as I said, let me just repeat this. I believe state capture and weak institutions, especially weak oversight institutions. This is what Liz pointed out in her intro note. These unfinished oversight institutions are the major reason why we have this reconvergence now. Yeah. So in Russia and China, of course, they never built them. So they were not interested in this. And we tried. I mean, in the Western Balkans, we did try. Yeah. But it didn't work out, it seems. And this exposure to the private, to to this to the private market now is making a similar system in the region, and half of the post-communist countries.
Great, thank you very much. Taina or Liz, I don't know, do you want to speak to this, Taina?
Sorry, in relation to your point about neoliberalism.
Yes, or Bernard's point about what's new about it, whether you're seeing sort of distinctive features coming out of.
Yeah, I partially addressed it before, but in relation to your point about neoliberalism, very quickly, I would highlight the fact that the dogma of the Washington Consensus also carried within itself this postulate that FDI, foreign direct investments, are good. And we're kind of still there. In terms of what is accepted generally by international institutions. So if you can show that your score of FDI is high, you're doing well. So I know, for instance, that banks in the financial centers worldwide are favorably impressed with what's going on in Serbia because these indicators are better. But the question is, are they benefiting the whole population? If we are to judge by the widespread discontent and by what we've seen today, this is quite doubtful. So yes, and maybe also to link this with another question that was saying about asking what can these international institutions such as World Bank, IMF, EU do better. I mean, there are many issues there, but I would say that the elephant in the room really is that they keep trying all the time to work with the elected institutions. As we've seen today, I mean, as it's very clear, this type of let's say governance malaises, let's call them like that, so state capture, corruption, or whatever that we're talking about today, are led by politics, are led by the very leaders of the countries that these institutions want to try to work with to stem corruption. And this simply doesn't work. So the solution to that is to change radically the way that we approach assistance in terms of democratization and of anti-corruption measures, and to go for the long view, the long run, and to really work for the bottom up. And I think, some of these development programs have got it, but we're a long way from understanding that properly and designing better anti-corruption measures in that sense.
Thank you, and thanks for picking up on that. We had a question from you and Grant along those lines, but also Liliana Kaci wrote in from Tirana with pretty much the same question, which I'd like to add in, which is, if there was one thing that isn't being done by international institutions, whether it's the European Union or the IMF, for example, that would improve the situation in the countries that you're writing about, what would it be? And by extension, what incentives perhaps could they create that would reward more positive developments that you're seeing? What do you feel are international interventions that could help, that you feel are missing? Anybody else want to come in on that? Because I think those are really important questions. Taina's saying it's not enough to just be partners with governments that we know are really problematic. There needs to be more imagination about what's being done. But what would that look like? What else could be done?
I mean, I can have a go. I think, the really important thing is civil society, just building capacity in civil society and being really tough on when governments are clamping down on civil society. So yeah, it takes a long time, to build up that kind of civil society. But actually, in Europe, you do see in some countries where there's a lot of really entrenched corruption, there is also really good civil society often. And that's the hope, I think, that you're starting to, not just that they're holding this government in check, but they're building up the skills and capacity that is going to create the next generation. And you've got this interesting thing happening in terms of human capital in anti-corruption, that we've now got quite a lot of leaders becoming, so someone who becomes the leader of an anti-corruption agency, they started off in civil society. So you've seen that in Moldova, in Argentina, and that's really interesting, actually. And so again, it does take a long time, all of this, but what you're seeing there is sort of a generation's worth of investment starting to feed through when there's a window of opportunity, so that you've got, you know, the capacity there when the political opportunity is created, if it is.
Thank you. That's a really interesting point. Anyone else want to come in on that question? What do you wish the EU would do about the countries that you're dealing with, or indeed the IMF or others? What are the tricks that they're missing? This deeper investment and support of civil society. Is there anything else? Dusan.
Yeah, I would just like to follow up on what Liz said. So civil society and media, I think, because you can have two approaches about this. You can say to these autocrats or leaders of captured states, I mean, you have to be more transparent, you have to publish every public procurement contract, you have to be open about your budget and stuff. It's not, you have to process your criminals. It's not going to work. This is too direct pressure, right? But this kind of indirect pressure, I mean, this is what might work, right? So if you open media, for example, and if you are and if you keep insisting that at least a larger extent of media freedom exists, people can hear about this. People will then take care of the autocrats themselves. Yeah? One of the problems in the Western Balkans is the lack of media freedom, as well as weak civil society, because the incumbent leaders take care of both things. And maybe some European and international agents can be tougher about both things, parallel to the process of let the incumbents do whatever they want to do in other areas. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to say a word on this as well, based on the only thing I can talk about, the example of Kosovo, which is maybe extreme. There, the international community essentially tried to do two main things. Now, if the analysis, and I follow Liz here, is that the rule of law is very important, what the international community did was to bring to Kosovo a whole judicial system, judges, prosecutors, everything. They kind of brought in a judicial system to give Kosovo an institution that it effectively lacked, and that didn't work at all. Then they were trying to build up civil society, exactly in the way you said, but that also didn't really work, because you created EU money and international money created a fairly artificial, bloated civil society sector, which mostly talked to each other in a kind of bubble without too much connection with the rest of society, which is, of course, the big difference with that grassroots movement that won the elections in the end. So these two routes, which would seem obvious, don't seem to work. Now, I think the issue there, one issue at least, well, these things are inherently difficult to do. And even the media, I mean, look at Hungary. My understanding, as far from reading the papers, the political coalition that is running the country has engineered a kind of private sector takeover of the private media. They're not doing it directly, and in a way, formally, it is unimpeachable. You know, if the Austrian company controlling the newspaper sold it to another one, what can you say? You can't complain with Orban if his friends are doing it. So these routes don't seem to work. One reason, I think, is that the external actor has usually at least two interests. One is the development interest. They want to create a good judiciary, strong civil society, and so on and so forth. The other one is a classical foreign policy interest. They want these governments to do what they like them to do in international fora, or on other things. They want to vote with them at the UN and so on. So they have to deal with these politicians. It is difficult at the same time to deal with the political elites in place and to undermine the basis of their power. So there has to be an explicit decision between these two priorities, and maybe they have to be given to different institutions, to the foreign ministry on one hand and to someone else on the other hand. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. I suppose if I could want them to do one thing, international institutions, it would be to change the business model of tax havens. Because I think if you had beneficial registers of ownership, registers of beneficial ownership, NGOs and oppositions could know what they were dealing with because they would know where the money was. And so I think tax havens are a fundamental bit of infrastructure behind the problems that we're talking about. And if they could be ended in some way, then there might be progress. Right, let me go back to questions. We have a great question from Thomas Steger. How do you consider the role of civil wars on the Balkans in the 1990s and as laying the groundwork for problems of state capture subsequently in terms of networks, as it were, predatory networks in financial terms? Tena, would you like to speak to that kind of path dependency question?
Sure. So definitely it did play a role because the way that privatization was carried out in the 1990s in most of the post-communist, post-socialist world was exacerbated. So privatization was never clean or fantastically carried out, of course, but in this area, it was even worsened by the presence of war and of instability. So, for instance, in Croatia, it was carried out in great haste at the beginning of the 1990s. Also partially in order to get some money in the state coffers to be able to afford for the war. But what happened in practice is that since privatization was carried out quite quickly in a period of great instability, all eyes were on the war. The best part of Croatian young men and even not so young men were actually fighting a war. Whereas a class of new/old/ transformist entrepreneurs managed to basically bank on what the state resources and the socially owned resources were, and to make this first accumulation of capital. So this definitely created an even inequality in terms of wealth inequality. And B, it's created, I think, really a lot of bitterness in society, which has been carried out, carried up to this day. So even today, the issue number one in Croatian politics, but I'm talking about Croatia, but that's very similar in Serbia, in Bosnia, and in other countries of Southeastern Europe, is this basically corruption and this perception that we're really unequal, which has been very clearly set in that moment in the early 1990s. And I would contrast that with the immediate neighbor, which is Slovenia, that has basically experienced no war. It was just the very beginning of the conflict was in Slovenia 5 days, and then Slovenia was luckily for it able to escape the conflict, where there was the space and the tranquility to have at least some form of political dialogue in that period. And eventually a road was taken, which was not the shock therapy approach, but more a gradualist approach that proved to be, although imperfect as everywhere, not so conducive to inequalities as it has been in other places. Then where, we could open a Pandora's vase now of Pandora's box of various variables and various determinants that can come in the picture. But I do think that, this moment of instability has been a big, has had a big impact in terms of this first accumulation of capital.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Dusan, do you want to speak to that question as well?
I think that Liz rose her hand.
Sorry, Liz, I didn't see you. Do come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Tena said. So definitely this kind of distraction of the war and the nationalist politics at the time meant that there was not much scrutiny And that then, I think, laid the groundwork, and a lot of Tenner's work is about those informal networks that were established then and how they then managed to convert their power. So, the questioner asks whether the state capture decreased when the wars ended. No, I think definitely not. And of course, that Sanader case in Croatia, that was happening after the war. So it more sort of set the framework for how things were going to work. But of course, the other thing that the wars did is it made it a really unattractive investment destination. So if you think that you're doing privatization in the 90s, possibly a slightly better way of doing it is to have big competitions, and you've got different foreign investors competing for those assets. And that wasn't necessarily completely without corruption by any means, but it did mean that you had some other options, and you really didn't have many other options. No one really wanted to invest in a country that was in conflict or just post-conflict. So that also added to the whole political economy, I think, of state capture.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Andrea, Dusan, do you want to come in on that question? Andrea.
Maybe I'll just say a word. I think the trajectory of Kosovo since the war was very much determined by how the war ended, because the dominant segment of the elite that governed the country until last February was really the heirs of the guerrillas. They managed to turn, it's a kind of state capture in three phases. They managed to turn military power into political power and then into economic power. And lock everything up in a kind of homogeneous way. My curiosity, maybe to Dusan, is this. In a way, based on this example, one could speak of a kind of winner's curse, because where you had the guerrillas winning the war, I mean, they had a head start in capturing the state and in the uncertain phase after the war. In Serbia, it was different. Serbia was, in a way, let's say they lost the war in the end, and they were able to kick Milosevic out. That opened a space which for a while was interestingly lively. Now it seems to have gone back to a pattern that is more similar to its neighbors. I wonder if there is something to say here.
But I just didn't get what was the question for me.
Serbia on one hand and Croatia and Kosovo on the other, let's say, ended the war very differently. Croatia and Kosovo had the military elites that won the war and had a head start in capturing the state. In Serbia, it was different. But now Serbia is converging on them in a way.
As I said, I think the major thing in Serbia was, as in Hungary and Poland, for example, when there was a window of opportunity for this to build strong oversight institutions, it didn't happen. So I think that's why the new political elite that came to power are now abusing their position, and I think similar thing is happening all over post-communist Europe, except for a couple of countries in like Estonia or Lithuania, Latvia. We see pretty similar process. So all these first 20, 30 years of transition, we thought that some countries actually that were the champions of transition, they are on the right path. It seems that it was not so, and only in some countries the problem occurred sooner. In some other countries, the problem occurred later.
Thank you very much. Can I pick up a question from Martin Todorov, which is, it gets at this question of how useful and how elastic does the concept of state capture become so elastic? Really, it stops being informative, and it gets at this interesting question of measurement. Are there, what do you think by now are the most effective measures or indicators of state capture in the countries that you're looking at? And if I could add to that, are there problems in the kind of one-size-fits-all measures, or are we looking at such distinctive dynamics within countries that actually we also always need to bear in mind the sort of specifics, that there might be key indicators, but that actually in order to capture the real dynamics of something, because it tends to vary in the countries that we're talking about, do you feel that that we need to be a little bit agnostic about how we're measuring things? Can you speak to the kind of challenges of how we measure this phenomena? Dusan, it's actually directed at you. He's asking what else can we examine other than the sort of the strength of the oversight institutions which you raise, and how democratic the ruling party is in its actual structure and foundations.
Well, let me answer the first question first, very briefly. State capture occurs anytime we see that public resource is used for some private purposes, and it is not used for public purposes. Right? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really matter who the capture is. We have the instance of state capture. So as we said, in the beginning, it were mainly private agents or corporate agents. Now politicians are dominant one. And as I try to argue, the difference today in Southeastern Europe is that this political capture is primarily used not for private wealth of politicians, although it is not out of the picture, but for political machinery for political parties to win next election. So this is now, I think, this is a sub-variety of state capture for this region. About measurement, Liz can also talk about, because she wrote a couple of articles with a Hungarian colleague, but very briefly, in terms of research, it's very useful. Because we can now be more precise about the extent of state capture. So if we can measure how many public contracts are wasted or abused, and how much money actually was abused, how much public funds were abused, then we can know exactly. And if we, for example, compare this to express it as a percentage of GDP, then it's pretty useful for theoretical and research grounds, but it's also very useful for practical grounds. You know, because everybody would know. If you say, for example, in this and that country, waste of public funds is 50% of GDP. You know, you can imagine how much money. You can express it in terms of how many kindergarten you could build, or how many schools you could have built with this money. That's very useful. Yeah? So a measurement is very useful in both cases, in research for us as researchers, but also for policymakers. And this is where the research becomes very useful for policy purposes.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Liz, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, Dusan, thanks for the plug for our work. But yeah, so we have come up with various ways, particularly my co-author Mihai Fazekas, of measuring corruption risks in procurement. And then in one paper, we look at what happens when there's a change of power. You know, ostensibly, there's no reason particularly why different companies should win public procurement contracts when there's a change of power. But if they do, and if those winning contracts are associated with a lot of corruption risks and red flags in the tender process, then you can estimate that there's a partisan element to the procurement process. So that's one thing you can do. Then we've also been looking at how you can then take that extra step that Dusan mentioned in terms of, so what's the cost of that, and being able to quantify, so what if you could reduce those corruption risks, how much money would you save? And I think that is a message that policymakers really want to hear. So definitely you can look at the procurement. I think another thing that you can do is look at what's the level of politicization over those implementation structures and over the accountability mechanisms. So how do you appoint people? So that's partly about going and looking at the legislative framework, but it's also you can count how much turnover was there in the civil service when when a new government came in. How deep does that go in the civil service? And those things, they don't necessarily tell you that there's capture, but they tell you that there's a risk that if that political elite wants to use those institutions for their own purposes or to neutralize them, then they've got a lot of power to do so if they've appointed loyal people to do it, and you can look at their connections and that kind of thing. So I think, yeah, just by sort of analysing more about how capture occurs, we can then think about, well, you know, what proxies are there then that we can measure for coming up with a measure of how deep and broad and wide it is, and what the costs might be of that.
Perfect, thank you very much. Taina, do you want to come in on that, or Andrea? Or are you happy to move on to further questions? Taina.
I'm happy to move on to other questions, but I would like to answer Martin's second part of the question. So he very rightly brings in, asks what is the EU's role in fostering a state capture model in EU member states. And I think here we need to bring in also the role of the European Parliament groupings. Of course, you know, the EU institutions are very complex. There are a lot of balances there. There are many of the institutions that play a big role. But I do think that, you know, that the EPP, and I dare, you know, point the finger at them most of all, have played an active role in aiding and abetting a lot of very grey, to say the least, and also outright damaging practices in a lot of EU member states without really blinking an eyelid, for the sake of balances in the European Parliament. But this is not, you know, exclusively the EPP. I manage the EPP because, of course, you know, the ruling party in Bulgaria is part of it, and several other problematic parties, such as, for instance, the former ruling party in North Macedonia, let's not forget, which was, you know, very clearly exposed as having ran an entrenched system of state capture through a wiretapping scandal that was leaked and was supported very openly by EPP members of the EPP. It's not only the EPP. For instance, you know, the one that the issue of the former Bulgarian politician Ahmed Dogan that I mentioned earlier. They are part of what was then called the ALDE grouping, so the liberals, those who formally stand for, you know, transparency and anti-corruption, etc., etc. So it's a problem all over the board. I would say here that maybe we can take some comfort in the fact that really it seems that the long run seems to be that green parties are taking over more and more from the more established, center left parties, at least, because the Greens so far have been very vocal against these kind of issues, and so far their contribution also to developing sort of civil society groups and these kind of bottom-up approaches also in the Balkans has been very, very good. So let's see about that. But definitely, this stabilitocracy mechanism of kind of privileging stability over deep-seated democracy for the sake of letting everything carry on in a pacific way is dominant both within the EU and in EU accession countries. And here I would say that that the elephant in the room in terms of why the EU is unable to deal with improving the state of the democracy in the Western Balkans more is the fact that there is no real EU perspective at the moment. There is just not. And this is down to political will of basically national governments more than anything else. So if that is the case, then the whole system of rewards and punishments that is at the basis of EU conditionality is simply lost. So, we can talk about all the various mechanisms and how they can be implemented better, but if this fails, then the whole purpose of it fails. So we should work on that first of all.
Thank you. Taina, I'd like to take the point you've made and extend it to the rest of the panel. How do you view the EU in recent years? Do you think it's becoming as much a part of the problem as part of the solution, in the sense of seeming to effectively accept member states with clear evidence of egregious corruption and state capture within their borders, and not having clear sanctions in response to that? Do you want to speak to that problem a bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I absolutely agree on this. I've been, really disappointed at how slow and little the EU has acted on Hungary and the rule of law issues. And I think that is damaging more broadly. It sends a signal that you can get away with this. You will still keep sending the money. And that is really sending a very strong signal around what you can get away with. But also, I think, more broadly, whether it's legitimate to get away with it. And I think that does have an impact on other countries, particularly other countries that haven't joined yet, but also, of course, countries that have. And, with the Western Balkans too. So I think there's that kind of tone issue, but then also with the Western Balkans, it's such a slow, long process. I see that someone's also asked about Georgia. I mean, when the prospect of membership is so incredibly distant, then it's really not going to be very powerful, I think, in terms of conditionality. So I think EU conditionality is pretty much non-existent these days.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Andrea, do you want to speak to that?
No, not really. Thank you. I fully agree with what Liz said. I entirely agree.
Dusha? Thank you. In that case, we've got two people asking sort of very related questions, I think. Velimir Sonia and Carlos Barbosa from Brazil are both asking about the size of the state, whether we couldn't be escaping some of these dynamics if the state itself was simply a far smaller budgetary agent, where there was simply less opportunity. So then we get into a conflict between the development economics on the importance of a developmental state that has the capacity to invest in infrastructure and skills and so on, versus the idea that as it were a worse fate would be the state capture that we see. So where do you find yourself sitting in terms of that balance? Would it be better to shrink the state and hope that the private sector can somehow lead a developmental process, or do you think a developmental state is an unavoidable necessity, but in that case we're stuck in the challenges of state capture? Where do you go with this? So let me start with Andrea and then come to Taylor.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question, but I think the question of the size of the state and what goes to the public sector, what goes to the private sector, can be viewed as logically subsequent to the question of what shapes the incentives of both public players and private players. If you think that ultimately outcomes are determined and performance in the medium to long term are determined by institutions and by the roots of institutions in the structure of power in society, then really the question of market versus state becomes a little bit secondary, because if you reduce the size of the state on the assumption that the market is more efficient, you are unlikely to get that efficiency you expect in the market, because the inadequacy of the rules of the game will affect that too. This is a debate we are very much having in Italy, for example, where we have weak institutions and an ongoing debate on whether we should restrict or expand the state, which went up and down in the past 20 or 30 years and is now reviving since 2008. In fact, we are a bit late. We are catching up with this debate, but we're having it. And I think those who argue for, in weak states, in states with weak institutions, those who argue that the solution is to move resources out of the public sector into the private sector risk having bad surprises. Because where institutions are weak, typically also the market doesn't work as well as you would expect. And you have the additional problem that possibly inequality becomes even greater, which creates an explosive mix. So this would be my answer: institutions first. But of course, below institutions are other things. Thank you.
Thank you. That would very much echo the development economist Peter Evans' point that the question is never really not how much, is never really how much state, it's what kind of state. And so we can't escape the quality of state question. Taina, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, so to your question, Abby, so do we want less states and more private sector, or less private sector, more state? I would say that these two are not necessarily in contradiction. It's not a zero-sum game, and that it really depends case by case. So to, Velimir Shonya's question, I agree completely with him that this is a huge issue. I think, this is especially lampant clear in the Croatian context. You have, the city of Zagreb that under Milan Bandic's rule there, the number of employees rose to over 3,200. The Greater London Authority employs 1,200 people, so kind of more than double, yeah. And in general, the Zagreb city holding has around 30,000 employees. So this is an over bloated public sector very, very clearly. And also another case in point is the reform of the local government in Croatia that has over 500 divisions that are absolutely not necessary in such numbers, that in a very under the radar way was simply swept under the carpet for lack of political will. So this is a clear case of an overbloated public sector that is of no benefit to anybody. So we can, shrink it without having to bring in the private sector necessarily. And I think it raises the very big issue also of, so of course we need legislative, so the political will to do that. To get to that, we need public pressure, so we need civil society, we need the media and all these things that we talked about. And we also need better hiring procedures. And this is really important all across the Balkans because it is linked with the electoral game. So this, I think, is really one area that the EU needs to devote more attention to if they get more serious about EU conditionality once again. It's one area that is more or less overlooked completely, and yet it is really crucial in all the dynamics that we have been talking about today in terms of state capture in the Balkans.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Does anybody else want to come in on that? Last question? No, Dusan.
Yeah, very briefly to what Velimir Shonya asked. The state in post-communist time shrank a lot. So, I mean, they are still big, but compared to what had existed prior to 1989, these are pretty small states, And what you brought up in the beginning about neoliberalism and this economic agenda, and especially with this new public management and the alleged superiority of private sector, look where we are now. So this is what has been implemented in the region and everywhere in the post-communist world over the past 30 years. It didn't work very well everywhere. Yeah. So maybe it's really, as somebody said, it's not how big state is, it's rather, what the state is doing, how it is doing, and what are the institutions, as Andrea said.
Fantastic, thank you very much. We're getting to the end of our time, so just as a kind of final, just sort of roundup question, can I ask each of you to talk about the immediate prospects as you see them? Do you think that this problem in the countries that you're particularly working on is one that you see deepening in the immediate future, or do you see rays of light? And if you see rays of light, where are they coming from? Andrea, do you want to?
Thank you. I talked about Kosovo. I am encouraged and optimistic about it. I think they took a huge step in the right direction. There are problems, of course, and after 20 years of so-called state capture, the whole public administration and the commanding heights of the economy are controlled by people tied to the old elite and who are themselves part of the old elite. So it will take a lot of effort and a lot of time to change that. But taking power so decisively is important. And it is a sign, I think, a vindication of the kind of things I was talking about. collective action, for example. In Italy, it is, by the way, I'm curious that nobody mentioned my comparison between Kosovo and Italy, to which, but in Italy it is more difficult. The country is suffering under this pandemic, has had maybe the worst dozen years of its history ever since it was unified in 1861, arguably including the Second World War. So it could go either way. Now we have lots of money, a very big facility from the European Union, which could change things, but I do not yet see the political organizations that can coordinate the demands of society and organize this kind of collective action. So we'll see.
Thank you very much. I think your cases echo the arguments that Alina Mungiu-Pipidi makes about how fundamentally political anti-corruption is as a project, because the stakes are so high and there's people in very privileged positions who don't wish to lose their privileges, then it ultimately comes down to a political fight, which is where collective action comes in, that you need mobilization ultimately to make decisive changes.
Add one word. The judges in Italy sent to jail a large part of our political elites for corruption. 15 years later, a similar political majority was making laws to prevent a similar anti-corruption investigation from happening again. Now, how can you reconcile the two? The judges themselves are totally incapable of, they can create an opening for political change. They cannot do it themselves. It didn't happen. Nobody was ready to pick up. So this was missing.
Thank you very much. Taina. I'm going to go in reverse order. Taina.
Do I see rays of light? Not immediate ones and not very bright ones. I think that the dominant modus operandi in most of these countries will keep being a clientelistic one for some time to come. And yet I do think that there are pockets of accountability that can be built and that there are being built. And that perhaps we can look at some local experiences as places where an experiment can occur in terms of transparency, in terms of changing norms, that then can lead the way to apply it on a more national level. And if these places are capitals of the states, then the bigger the experiment, the better. So this is my small ray of light.
Thank you very much, Dusan.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to this question. I simply don't know. Yeah, probably the answer is somewhere in the future, but I'm not able to see it now.
Thank you, Liz.
I'm afraid I don't really see rays of light at the moment in Hungary. There is an election next year, so there's always a chance, but yeah, there's a lot stacked against the opposition. I'm also increasingly worried about the UK. So watching Hungary in the last 10 years has taught me how easy it is to slide. 20 years ago, it really was seen as a front runner of transition. Changes of power were happening in a stable way, fast-growing economy, lots of foreign investment, and what a fall. So I'm quite worried about the UK at the moment, and I think there is some good media criticism and a bit of pushback from the institutions, but there's also been a lack of investment in key accountability institutions over a really long period, which we are seeing the effects of.
Thank you very much. I would just simply, sadly, agree with you on that. I think we're seeing how incredibly easy it is to instrumentalize the corporate state ties that are now thoroughly institutionalized in the UK, and we can see the kind of the worst potential of that, which I think is very worrying. Right, on that very sober note, I'm going to draw this to a close because I'm afraid we've run out of time. My apologies to people whose questions I haven't been able to put forward. I really want to thank all of our panelists for a really serious and timely discussion, and I particularly want to thank Taina and Megan Palmer for having the inspiration to put this panel together, because I think it was a prescient and really useful thing to do. And to thank everybody who's joined us for joining in the discussion and offering us such great questions. If I can finish with a little advertising, this discussion was part of a series. The next in the series is on Friday, the 28th of May at 4 p.m. and the subject is China and China's 17+1 policy in Europe, which is basically the Chinese policy of cooperation with Central and Eastern Europe. So thank you, everybody. Thank you in particular to the panel, and let me wish you all a very good weekend until we meet online and hopefully even face-to-face at some point in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.